You know how it is when Halloween rolls around? All those memories come back like ghosts, sneaking up on you just when you think you've forgotten them. For me, it's always Daryl I end up thinking about, even though he's been gone a long time now. You know, you have these friendships when you're a kid that seem like they're gonna last forever, and then life happens, pulls the rug out from under you, and before you know it, all you got left is memories. Maybe not even the good ones. Daryl and I grew up in the same neighborhood. He lived over on Redfern, and I was a few blocks down on Old Creek. We met in first grade and stuck together like glue all the way through middle school. But it wasn't just us. We had our group, a tight little circle of friends. There was Tom, who lived on Briarwood where his dad ran the grocery shop, and Benji, who was the smallest of us, but never backed down from a dare. His mom worked at the library down on Perry Lane, and he was always picking up stories from her about haunted places around town. So when Halloween came around, that's all we could think about. Scary places we could explore, legends we could prove or disprove. We were almost 13 that Halloween night in '98, right at that age where trick-or-treating started feeling a little too kiddish, but haunted houses were irresistible. It was the night before Halloween, and we'd planned this big scare fest, just the four of us. The talk started with the old Daly house over on Grand. Supposedly, there had been footsteps heard in the basement after old Mrs. Daly passed, and no one had dared to move in since. There was St. John's Cemetery, too, a place known for strange lights and sounds, but it was too far out of the way for us to bother. But then Benji started talking about this other place, the old Barrow House. It wasn't far, and we'd passed it 100 times. It sat right at the end of Jefferson Road, half sunken and overgrown, its porch leaning forward like it was about to give way. The place had been there forever, but it was so run down that none of us could imagine anyone ever living there. Benji swore he'd overheard his mom say that something terrible had happened there, something dark enough that no one dared to go near it anymore. Even though it sounded ridiculous, that house was our best shot at a good scare. It was already dark when we left, and I remember my mom warning me not to stay out too late. The air was chilly, our breath coming out in clouds as we walked down the sidewalk, passing the old lamppost that gave the streets an eerie, yellow glow. When we got to Jefferson Road, it felt like we'd crossed into another world. The trees closed in tighter, their branches bare and clawing at the sky like something out of a horror movie. We finally reached the gate, and there it was, the Barrow House, looming up in front of us. 2 stories tall, the windows boarded up, and the roof sagging like the house itself was tired of being there. Daryl and I looked at each other, both of us grinning but nervous. Tom, ever the brave one, dared Daryl to go in first, his eyes glinting with a challenge. Daryl grinned back, trying to look fearless, but I saw the hesitation in his eyes. "I'll do it," he said, "but only if you promise me all the Snickers from your trick-or-treat haul tomorrow." That's how Daryl was, always needing to prove himself. Tom agreed, and Daryl grinned. So he took a deep breath and started toward the front path, flashlight in hand. We watched him go, holding our breath as he reached the front steps, each one creaking under his weight. He glanced back at us before stepping through the broken doorway, like he was half hoping one of us would call him back, but none of us did. 1 minute passed, then 2. The wind howled around us, carrying the faint smell of something rotting from the house. I remember looking over at Benji, who was nervously biting his lip, his eyes darting back and forth between the house and his watch. Tom tried to keep up the brave front, but I could see the worry creeping into his face too. At the 6-minute mark, Tom finally said, "That's it, I'm going in to get him." He took a step toward the gate, but just then we saw a flicker of movement inside, and out came Daryl, walking slowly, almost like he was in a trance. We all let out a sigh of relief, but as he got closer, something didn't look right. He wasn't grinning, wasn't laughing, wasn't saying a word about what he'd seen inside. His face was pale, eyes wide and unfocused, like he was looking at something only he could see. Benji reached out, put a hand on his shoulder, and Daryl jerked back like he'd been shocked. "Hey, Daryl, what did you see in there?" Tom asked, his voice a little quieter now, like he was almost afraid of the answer. But Daryl didn't respond. He just kept walking, his steps quickening until he was practically running down the street, away from us, away from that house. We called after him, but he didn't look back, didn't say a word. We stood there for a while, unsure of what to do. The whole night felt like it had turned dark and heavy, like there was something in the air we couldn't see but could definitely feel. Finally, we decided to head home. None of us talked much on the way back, and I remember feeling like a weight had settled in my chest, this dread that wouldn't go away. The next day, Halloween, we met up like usual, but Daryl was nowhere to be found. We waited around, thinking maybe he'd just overslept or was running late, but he never showed, so we went trick-or-treating without him, though it didn't feel right. Every house we stopped at, I couldn't help but wonder where he was, if he was okay. That night, after I dumped my candy haul on the kitchen table, I decided to call him. His mom answered, sounding worn out, like she hadn't slept. When I asked if I could talk to Daryl, she paused, then said he wasn't feeling well and was resting in his room. I asked if he was okay, and she just said he'd been a bit under the weather. There was something in her voice, something off, like she didn't want to say too much. A few days passed, and Daryl still wasn't himself. When he finally showed up at school, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. His face was pale, his eyes dark, and he kept his head down, avoiding us. I tried to talk to him, tried to ask him what happened that night, but he just looked at me, his eyes empty, and muttered, "Don't ask." Then he walked away. We tried to give him space, figuring he'd come around, but he didn't. He drifted further and further away from us, like he was being pulled into some place we couldn't follow. Even Tom, who usually never gave up on anything, eventually stopped trying to reach him. Daryl was just gone. At least the Daryl we knew. Then, one day after winter break, Daryl didn't come back to school. His family had moved, just like that, with no warning. We heard later that they'd gone up north somewhere, closer to his mom's family. We tried to keep in touch, but he never responded to our letters. It was like he'd disappeared. Years went by, and though life went on, that Halloween night always stayed with me. This nagging memory that wouldn't go away. What had he seen in that house? I could never bring myself to go back there. Maybe part of me was afraid I'd find out. It was about 10 years later, and I was scrolling through Facebook one night, and I decided to search for him. There were a few profiles with his name, but one caught my eye. A profile with no picture, no information, just the name, Daryl Morgan. I sent a friend request, hoping maybe he'd see it. Maybe he'd reach out. A week later, I got a message from his account. My heart jumped, and I clicked it open, but it wasn't from him. It was from someone named Rachel, who said she was Daryl's sister. She thanked me for reaching out, but then she told me that Daryl had passed away a few years back. A drug overdose. Heroin. He hadn't even turned 30. I sat there staring at the screen, unable to process it. She told me he'd struggled for years, in and out of rehab, but he'd never found peace. She said he'd been troubled since he was a teenager, that he'd never been the same after some incident back in Woodfield. I didn't need to ask what she meant. I knew. I ended up going back to Woodfield a few years after that, just to see it again. See if the barrow house was still there. But it was gone. Just an empty lot with a few rotting boards and some yellow caution tape fluttering in the wind. The sight of that empty lot hit me harder than I expected. It was like all those years of wondering, of holding on to that memory, just unraveled in front of me. Whatever secrets that house held were buried now, the last remnants swept away without a trace, leaving only questions I'd never get answers to. I stood there for a while, staring at the vacant lot, trying to imagine what it might have been like for Daryl that night. The wind whipped around me, and I could almost hear echoes of our laughter, those same chills creeping over me that we'd felt that Halloween so many years ago. And for a second, I wondered if maybe, somehow, he was still here, lingering with the house's shadow, like a piece of him had never left. On my way back to my old neighborhood, I stopped at a little diner we used to hang out at after school, hoping the familiarity might help me shake the feeling. While I was nursing a cup of coffee, I saw a guy sitting down the counter, around our age, with that unmistakable look of someone who'd stayed in Woodfield. It took me a second, but I recognized him. It was Benji, the smallest of us, now older, broader, but with that same thoughtful expression. I hadn't seen him since high school, but I decided to walk over, and he lit up when he recognized me. We got to talking, reminiscing, sharing those remember when stories that always come up when old friends reunite. Eventually, I brought up Daryl, hesitantly, wondering if he'd heard the news. Benji's face darkened, and he nodded, looking away for a second before speaking. I always wondered what he saw in that house, he murmured, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. You know, he used to come by my house late at night, a few times after that night, before he moved away. He'd just stand outside, like he wanted to come in, but then he'd turn around and leave without saying a word. This sent a chill down my spine. I'd always thought Daryl had just shut us out, that he'd moved on with his life without us. But this was something else. Did he ever say anything to you about it? I asked. Benji shook his head. Nah, he never did. But he looked haunted, like something was eating away at him. He hesitated, then added, I remember one time he left a piece of paper on my doorstep. No note, no explanation, just this old crumpled scrap of paper. It had this strange symbol on it, like some kind of marking, almost like a brand. I felt a shiver run through me. A part of me wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but I could see from the look in Benji's eyes that he was just as unnerved by it as I was. We sat in silence for a while, the memories weighing heavy between us. Finally, he looked up and said, I never wanted to go back there, to that house. I always felt like it was better left alone, like whatever Daryl found in there was his burden alone. We finished our coffee, and I left the diner feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief, like a chapter had finally closed, but the story itself would always remain unfinished. Over the years, I tried to move on, to let the memories fade, but every Halloween, I find myself drifting back to that night, to the old barrow house, and the friend who walked into it and never really came back. Part of me still wonders what Daryl saw in there, what left him so hollow and haunted. And maybe it's better I never found out. But every now and then, when I'm alone, I think I can feel him, like he's just around the corner, waiting to tell me something he never could in life. And maybe, in some way, he is.